Welcome back, everyone. We are continuing our 5-day-a-week broadcast on the coronavirus, the CCP virus. And I'm again here, my apartment in Queens, broadcasting from home. We're not necessarily on full lockdown here, but given the situation, makes it a bit easier to record from home here. So we're going to start today with an interesting rumor, a credible rumor of what's taking place right now in Beijing. Now, there have been videos and photographs alleging that the Chinese military, the People's Liberation Army, is moving into Beijing. Now, this was reported by Taiwanese media, and locals in Beijing have been posting these videos and photographs. We cannot verify what's happening, but given the situation and what we've seen, I think it's worth reporting. Now, again, there are reports in Taiwanese media. There are videos, for example, of buses with no license plates apparently moving into Beijing, and on these buses appear to be People's Liberation Army or Chinese military soldiers. It happens as the Chinese Communist Party has held its mourning day on April 4th. In other words, it's the day the Chinese Communist Party chose to let people mourn their dead because of the virus. Same day that happens as mourning day, videos and photographs appeared that seem to be the Chinese military moving into Beijing. Now, I'll be honest that the, say, community of Chinese, China watchers, analysts, a lot of them aren't sure what to think about it. I've read a few different email lists. I've looked at some different analysis from different sources. It seems nobody knows quite what to think of what's going on right now. Some suggest, oh, well, it could be that because of this National Mourning Day, they're bringing PLA, soldiers to go home to mourn their dead. If that were the case, you would expect Chinese media, the state-run media, to make more of a show about it. But the Chinese media has been or the mainland Chinese media has been completely silent on this, dead silent. Also, there were buses moving into Beijing with these soldiers on them. Beijing has a strict no-entrance policy unless you live or work there, and so who knows what's going on. There were also some reports saying that buses that tried entering from the north were turned away. So something strange is going on in Beijing, that's all we can say. Some reports again suggesting this might be part of the whole power struggle, that maybe at the high levels of the Chinese Communist Party something is going on. If that were the case, the Xi faction, Xi Jinping, does control the PLA. The rival faction, the Jiang faction, does not. It's not to say the Jiang faction couldn't somehow have gotten influence over it. Who knows? Right now, this is all just, I don't know what's going on. Nobody knows what's going on. We're just seeing reports of this taking place, and I think the reports are credible enough to mention, but it's something we'll have to keep an eye on to see how this develops. In addition to this, there was a mysterious PLA helicopter crash in Hong Kong in the wilderness of Taiwan. This is a report from Asia Times. It says, mystery surrounds the crash of a helicopter belonging to the People's Liberation Army's garrison in Hong Kong. People's Liberation Army being the Chinese Communist Party's military. And again, I've mentioned it before, but I'll say it again. The People's Liberation Army is not a military like we have in the United States. In the United States, the U.S. military, they're sworn as part of their oath to uphold and protect the Constitution of the United States. Under the Chinese Communist Party, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, is sworn to protect the party. In other words, it's a party military. Sort of like, imagine if the U.S. military were sworn to protect the Democrat Party or the Republican Party. It would be like that. This is a party military. And so it's saying that this helicopter in Hong Kong went down in the wilderness of Thailand, one of the city's largest country parks, during a training session on Monday afternoon. And it says, quote, there was no word from both the Chinese military or the city's government about what happened. Strange occurrence, as far as I know, and I've read other comments saying that there have been no known cases like this before. So who knows what happened? Also, there's an interesting article in The Trumpet. It's saying that the Chinese military has been advancing under the cover of the coronavirus, the CCP virus. It says, quote, Chinese President Xi Jinping, not really a president because he's not elected, but still, has seized this opportunity to intimidate Taiwan, influence Europe, modernize its military, and entrench itself deeper into the South China Sea. It says, quote, China's state-controlled Global Times reported that, quote, training for war preparedness will not be stopped, even in the middle of the COVID-19 epidemic. And it says, quote, the United States has been aware of China's actions. On March 4th, it notes, the House of Representatives passed the Taipei Act, or the Taiwan Allies International Protection and Enhancement Initiative, which was later signed into law by U.S. President Donald Trump. The Chinese military has been more active lately, it seems, in addition to these reports. There are also some local reports on the ground saying they've resumed military production in Wuhan. Again, unclear what's really going on, unclear if they are even doing what they claim they're doing, but regardless, we can say the Chinese military is behaving oddly currently. Next, we have an update on the ventilators and medical supplies. Now, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo is now saying more ventilators are inbound to New York from China and Oregon. This is after, of course, Cuomo turned down an offer from Remington, the firearms manufacturer, to manufacture face masks for New York. He's buying them from China. China is sending 1,000 face masks as ventilators. Oregon is shipping 140. Of course, there have been a lot of criticisms against Cuomo for accepting face masks from the Chinese Communist Party, while Remington, an American company, has been denied its offer to manufacture face masks for New York. And another note, Germany accused the United States of, quote, piracy for diverting a shipment of masks, but it has gone back on that claim after finding the masks had been ordered by a German firm and not an American firm. Some news outlets didn't correct that after first publishing it. Now, there's a quote from Wall Street Journal. It says, quote, German officials said a shipment of face masks destined for Germany was seized at Bangkok airport and diverted to the U.S. in an act of, quote, modern piracy. Now, on the accusation from Germany, Andreas Gysi, Berlin's senator for the Interior, wrote on Twitter on Saturday, quote, according to Washington Post, that he had clarified that the order was placed with a German firm and that the supply chain issues were being reviewed. Now, in other news, a U.S. senator is pushing to end U.S. dependence on the Chinese Communist Party for the U.S. pharmaceutical industry. Currently, about 80% of U.S. pharmaceutical active ingredients come from China and India, but mainly from China. And even a lot of the ones in India have Chinese ingredients in them. A great book on this, actually, that blew the whistle pretty early on was China RX. I've actually written about it before in the Epoch Times. Now, this is a quote from Fox News that says, Tennessee Senator Marsha Blackburn wants to bring the U.S. pharma supply back to the U.S. And it again notes about 80% of active pharma ingredients in the U.S. come from China and India. It's interesting, actually, seeing how this current pandemic is starting to wake up the U.S. to the problems of manufacturing critical supplies in China. Because the Chinese Communist Party has made quotes like, throwing America into the sea of the coronavirus. The Chinese Communist Party has demonstrated that in times of crisis it will deny shipments to the U.S. of things we need. There's also news coming out now that before the U.S. kind of fell into this current state where cities and states are having problems where they don't have enough face masks or medical supplies, like here in New York, for example, it's very difficult to find face masks here, and it's even more difficult because some stores, supermarkets, won't let you in without one. Current alerts going out are saying if you don't have a face mask, wear a bandana or a scarf. It turns out now that the United States or U.S. companies were exporting face masks and medical supplies to China before the shortages hit here. USA Today actually had a good story on this. They wrote that, quote, U.S. companies sold more than $17.5 million in face masks $13.6 million in surgical garments, and $27.5 million in ventilators to China in January and February. And of course now we have a shortage, and of course the Chinese Communist Party has nationalized companies that were manufacturing these in China and limiting shipments abroad. And it's also coming out now that in Australia, an individual with ties to the Chinese military, the People's Liberation Army, was behind the export of tons of medical goods to China. This is a quote from the Sydney Morning Herald. It says, "A former Chinese military officer worked with Chinese Communist Party agencies and a group with links to organized crime to export tons of Australian medical supplies to Wuhan at the height of the coronavirus epidemic there." Now, a few things interesting about this. You have a former Chinese military officer working with Chinese Communist Party agencies and a group with links to organized crime. Now, when I read that, I think United Front Department. Those of you who follow my work know that since about 2008, this has been a focus of my investigations. And of course, I'm senior investigative reporter at the Epoch Times. A lot of my work focused on the United Front operations of the Chinese Communist Party here in New York. But of course, this is a global issue. The United Front is one of the Chinese Communist Party's main overt espionage departments. It does not always violate the law. It works open, plain, bright, sunny days out in the open. You can see people carrying banners with organizations under the United Front on them in Chinatowns. The United Front is the department of the Chinese Communist Party that works on exporting the power structures of the Chinese regime into foreign Chinese communities. And so in a lot of parts of the world, the reason Chinatowns are so insulated and so hard to figure out and so hard to get into is because of the Tongs. Tongs are like fraternal organizations, guilds you could call them. They're hometown associations. They're sometimes unions focused on, say, oil workers, police tongs, things like this. When the Chinese Communist Party wanted to go abroad and start gaining more control over foreign Chinese communities, they worked through the consulates. The consulates started approaching the Tongs, these fraternal organizations. Now beneath a lot of the Tongs are the triads, the Chinese mafia. Here in New York, one of the groups I exposed is the Fujian American Association, one of the main groups that is closest to the Chinese Communist Party, and beneath which is the Fuqing Gang, one of the largest transnational crime groups in the world. There have been reports, of course, of how the Chinese Communist Party uses the triads, the Chinese mafia, as its strong arm in foreign communities. Here in New York, I had Chinese people telling me that they were told that the Chinese regime could make them disappear. There are people in the United States, even in major U.S. cities, who do not feel the protection of the United States government. A sister branch of the United Front is the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office, which works in the same operations. And they target overseas Chinese to bring them into the system. They even regard second and third generation Chinese as part of this system. And if Chinese students, Chinese democracy activists, Chinese dissidents dare to speak out against the Chinese Communist Party, even on U.S. soil, even on Australian soil, they risk getting threatened, their families risk getting threatened, and so on, and it's because of the United Front Department. And so when I see articles like this one talking about links of military officers, Chinese Communist Party agencies, and organized crime, very likely this is related to the United Front. Now, going on, there are groups now in London. It's a London think tank, the Henry Jackson Society, saying that China should be sued for $6.5 trillion minimum for the damages that they've caused by censoring news on the coronavirus, on the CCP virus, allowing it to spread across the globe, and leaving many countries unprepared for what they were facing. Of course, in the United States, you may have seen that Adam Schiff is calling for an investigation into Trump's handling of the virus. Vice President Mike Pence came out and said, well, the reason we were less prepared than we should have been was because of the CDC and also the Chinese Communist Party, censoring information, lying to international organizations like the CDC, like the WHO, which then repeated the information to the American public and to American agencies. The Chinese Communist Party not only censored information, but even arrested people who spoke out about it. There were 8 doctors in China who were silenced, one of whom was arrested and died of the virus, allegedly. And so, of course, now different countries are calling for lawsuits against the Chinese Communist Party for what it did, for censoring this, for not being open about what was actually taking place, so that places like New York could have been better prepared, so that Italy could have been better prepared, so that the UK could have been better prepared, and they were not. Few of you in the comments, and I do read the comments, and I appreciate everything you guys write. I really enjoy reading the comments. Few of you mentioned that I made an error in a recent report about the Philippines, where I said Duterte allegedly said that civilians would be shot for violating the quarantine. That was apparently fake news, and I apologize for, not checking it better. It's an ongoing problem. It's very hard to trust anything on the surface with a lot of news outlets these days, because yes, they're not always genuine about what's really taking place. I'll read a couple comments from you and then, of course, correct it. This is from Letty Bess. She said, quote, "I love watching Epoch Times videos. I'm a Filipino-American and a conservative. My families are all living in the Philippines. The news that is circulating about your pronouncement of President Rodrigo Duterte was taken out of context. There are factions ongoing in the government that are taking advantage of this pandemic to create chaos. The President, Duterte, was referring to these factions/people to strictly follow the stay-at-home order. There was an incident that these people went out and lined up on the street waiting for the food distribution. Even they had been told to wait from home to receive food from the government. The actions of these people created chaos between them and the policemen. When the policemen told them to go home, as there is no food distribution that will occur on the streets," she said, "President Duterte's message was to the policemen, if chaos will happen again, and these people try to hurt the policemen, that may endanger the policeman's life, they have the right to shoot, to defend their life against these factions. There are more than 12 million people living in greater Metro Manila area. Social distancing is a must, and I do understand how difficult it is. We are peace-loving and don't want violence." All right, I won't read the whole comment because it's a bit long, but Letty Bess, I really appreciate you clarifying this. Also, another viewer wrote, this is Christian Feliciano. He said, "Hey Joshua, I love and support every content that you make, but the information that you got from our president in the Philippines is not correct. That is just what the biased media are spreading as a narrative based on his latest speech. He was actually referring to the leftists, he mentioned that before, which are the rebel groups in our country who are maliciously spreading false information to cause panic to the impoverished masses. What he actually said was, to all the police and soldiers, if these leftists cause trouble, resist arrest and do things that put your lives at risk, shoot them. He basically wants to protect the lives of police and the military, as well as the healthcare workers, because there are people who attack our healthcare workers in fear of the virus, and the politicians here are capitalizing the pandemic to divide the country." And yeah, I understand that some of the information on Duterte and his, say, very strong approach when dealing with drug cartels and different rebel groups have gotten him a lot of criticism in the United States and in other countries. Actually, I have a friend who's from the same hometown as Duterte, and he kind of clarified to me what the situation is like there. This friend told me that basically growing up in the Philippines, when he had a lot of communist revolutionary groups trying to start their various movements in the Philippines, he said it was so common to see dead people that you stopped feeling anything towards it. It was very common to see. He said that basically these groups had put kill-on-sight orders on police, and because of this, a lot of the police had, of course, kill-on-sight orders for a lot of these rebel groups. But given the fact that they could easily blend into the public, that was very difficult. The situation in the Philippines was that, similar to other countries like Brazil for a long time, drug cartels, criminal organizations were able to act with impunity, and the police often had their hands tied behind their back. And so it's good to understand the context of these types of things, even if the approaches being used to stop them are different from what we do in the United States, for example. So thank you again, all of you, for clarifying this. And yes, actually, I did check the claims on this. It is true. Duterte said people can be shot if they riot or try to disrupt food distribution. It was not about shooting people who violate the quarantine, as some news outlets had reported. And so again, I apologize for the error. Now, moving on to some news in the United States right now, Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi are working on the next relief package for the CCP virus, the coronavirus. They, of course, passed the first relief package. Hopefully we'll all be getting some checks in the mail soon to help us out. McConnell said, according to MarketWatch, that the new package should be more a targeted response to what we got wrong and what we didn't do enough for. And at the top of the list, there would have to be the healthcare part of it. And Pelosi said, interestingly, on Friday, that the next coronavirus aid bill should build on the bipartisan relief bills that Congress has passed so far, rather than include broader Democratic agenda items such as infrastructure and rural broadband access. Interesting to see this. Of course, we'll have to see what's in it. As I mentioned before, last time there was a lot of back and forth. Democrats accused Republicans of doing too much to help corporations, big businesses. Republicans also pointed out that Democrats had a lot of things that were totally unrelated to the virus, such as things around the elections, things banning, for example, voter ID, things like that. We'll have to really keep an eye on to see what's in it. Now, also in the United States, there is a shortage of doctors, and so individuals not necessarily who work in the ER are being recruited to work in the ER. This includes in New York dermatologists and orthopedists being drafted to work in the emergency room. And Missouri is also taking similar steps. They're even asking retired medical staff to come and help. In Kentucky, meanwhile, there are churches planning to gather despite virus orders. Of course, in New York, this has been a big issue. In a lot of places in the U.S., this has been a big issue. Now, there are a lot of Americans noting that they believe this is a violation of the U.S. Constitution. It violates the right to assemble and the right to believe what you want to believe. And so by restricting religion, they believe this is, of course, sacrificing those rights. And a lot of them believe government has overstepped its boundaries by forbidding those two things. Of course, hard to say if the virus situation is anything like it is in China, it could be very bad. I also understand that, it's not an easy situation, and whether government should have the right to restrict assembly, especially for worship, it does overstep anything I think we've ever seen in the U.S. Meanwhile, the captain of the USS Roosevelt, which is that aircraft carrier that docked off Guam because many crew allegedly had the coronavirus, tested positive for it. And of course, they were given treatment in Guam, not allowed to travel around the country, but given hospital beds. He wrote a letter that was then leaked to the press, to the San Francisco Chronicle, and then, of course, others reported it. When he reported on this show, it was kind of all out by then. But he's been criticized for making that public without allegedly telling his superiors about the issues he was facing before he wrote this whole letter. Now, the firing was allegedly because of the way he went about this, not because he was concerned about the health of his troops. There was concern that because he, of course, wrote this letter, which was then leaked to the press somehow, that he put that ship in danger because he told U.S. adversaries that there was a ship in danger, that U.S. troops would be seeking care in Guam and basically dead in the water, possibly, while this thing goes on. The acting Navy Secretary, Thomas Modly, announced at the Pentagon, quote, "It undermines our efforts and the chain of command's efforts to address this problem. It creates a panic and creates the perception that the Navy is not on the job, the government's not on the job, and that's just not true." And Trump agreed with the move. He said, quote, "The letter was all over the place. That's not appropriate." Trump is meanwhile warning Americans to prepare for, quote, "the toughest week." And he said there could be, quote, "a lot of deaths." April Initially, April was believed to be the month where the virus would end, when weather starts getting warmer. That was, of course, based on the analysis of the SARS virus in 2002 and 2003, which did go away once weather warmed up. It is not appearing that that is going to be the case with this virus. Of course, who knows what happened with SARS? The Chinese Communist Party was also covering up the SARS outbreak back then. And, of course, it's unclear whether it went away because of the warm weather, which was just part of the way it happened, of course, or whether it had run its course by then and went away naturally. There was speculation that within 2 weeks things could peak here in the United States. We'll have to see what happens. Regardless, Trump is warning Americans to be prepared for this. Also, the Chinese Communist Party is flooding Facebook with undeclared coronavirus propaganda ads blaming Trump for the virus outbreak. Telegraph had the exclusive on this. They reported, quote, Chinese state media is flooding Facebook and Instagram with undisclosed political adverts, whitewashing its role in the coronavirus pandemic and pinning the blame on Donald Trump. It says, quote, 3 official news outlets, Xinhua Central, China Central Television, CCTV, and the Global Times, have targeted users across the world with promoted stories in English, Chinese, and Arabic. And it says, quote, these ads, seen millions of times, extolled China's efforts against COVID-19, downplayed its domestic outbreak, depicted Mr. Trump as misguided and racist, and suggested the virus might have originated in the U.S. Of course, Xinhua, CCTV, and Global Times are registered in the United States under the State Department as official foreign missions of the Chinese Communist Party. These are not normal news outlets. They are official missions of the Chinese Communist Party. In other words, basically branches of the Chinese Communist Party operating abroad. As I've mentioned before, China Daily publishes China Watch, and China Watch has inserts in about 30 U.S. publications, including major newspapers like the New York Times, like the Washington Post, and others. The Chinese Communist Party has been spreading disinformation in the United States, claiming that this virus did not originate in China, that the outbreak started in China but did not necessarily come from China, and they've been trying to blame the United States for it. Meanwhile, they're saying anyone pointing to the fact that this virus came from China is racist, because viruses have no borders, viruses have no nationality. And unfortunately, a lot of U.S. news outlets have been using the same narrative the Chinese Communist Party has been spreading, also saying that it's racist if you point to the origin of this virus, although it seems that narrative is starting to die down. Meanwhile, the Chinese Communist Party has been appointed to the United Nations Human Rights Council. You heard that right. And it says it will help pick experts on free speech, health, and arbitrary detention. UN Watch had an article on this talking about it. For those of you who watched my other show, which was on for a bit, I merged it into Crossroads. It was called the China Report. I had a China expert named Alex Newman on, and actually we had a whole episode about how the United Nations punished a whistleblower for exposing the Chinese Communist Party's human rights abuses. Long story short, he did an investigative article on this for Epoch Times. He's a contributor. And he exposed how basically there were Chinese dissidents who were supposed to testify to the United Nations about abuses they had faced in China. The United Nations leaked the names or provided the names of those individuals to the Chinese Communist Party. And then the Chinese Communist Party prevented their travel, arrested them, one of them died in custody. And then the whistleblower in the United Nations who came and tried making this public was punished by the United Nations. And now the United Nations is allowing the Chinese Communist Party to be appointed to the UN Human Rights Council panel. Go figure. And of course this happens as the WHO, the World Health Organization, is being criticized for pandering to the Chinese Communist Party, and the United Nations itself is really being called out for its ties to the Chinese Communist Party. Now in other news, Australian politicians have launched an attack on the Chinese Communist Party, a verbal attack, for, quote, failing to contain the coronavirus. This is from Daily Mail. It says senior MPs said China must reap economic consequences due to coronavirus. There are calls for Australia to reassess its relationship with China after the pandemic, and one MP is demanding an investigation into the virus. Australia has been an interesting place when it comes to the Chinese Communist Party's systems for overseas influence. I've heard from different sources saying that basically when the Chinese Communist Party wants to launch overt operations like the United Front against the United States, they first run the operations in Australia, then Canada, then the US. Regardless of whether that's true or not, Australia is kind of ground zero for a lot of the Chinese Communist Party's systems of subversion. And it's interesting that in Australia, actually the media there has been a lot more on it than the US media has. They've been calling out the United Front directly. They've been calling out the Chinese Communist Party's influence at Australian universities. They've been noting that even Chinese students can be pressured or threatened if they speak out against the Chinese Communist Party on Australian campuses. Of course, it happens in the US as well. Also, you may remember we had a report talking about how the Trump administration may block Huawei from purchasing semiconductors, these computer chips from Taiwan, and how basically if that happens, Huawei could have a lot of trouble manufacturing smartphones and other devices. Huawei being one of the largest telecom companies in the world, and of course part of the backbone of the Chinese Communist Party's One Belt, One Road initiative, which is their whole program for overseas influence, getting countries into debt traps, and building things like 5G. Now, what's interesting in this latest development, there's a state-owned Chinese investor trying to seize control of chip designer Imagination. Now, this is from Sky News. It says, quote, a state-controlled Chinese investor is trying to seize control of Imagination's Technologies Group, the British chip designer, sparking fears that its prized intellectual property assets could disappear from the UK. Of course, this is in context of Huawei very likely being concerned about what's going to happen to it if it loses the ability to purchase chips from Taiwan. China cannot manufacture these chips by itself, at least not at current generation standards. And so Huawei was actually calling for retaliation against US companies if the US moves through with that. Also, Zoom, this teleconference technology a lot of us use, allows you to, say, join online school classes and other things, is being called out for diverting web traffic through Chinese servers. And Zoom has admitted that user data was mistakenly, allegedly, routed through China. So that's now confirmed, no longer just a rumor. And there's been a very bizarre story that was published in China Daily, again, one of the mouthpieces of the Chinese Communist Party, again registered as a foreign mission of the Chinese Communist Party. We'll show some photos of what they have here. It says, Wuhan residents reviving appetite for life, noodles. And China Daily published a series of I think 6 photographs showing a very bizarre looking outdoor restaurant in Wuhan. And the pictures are of mannequins playing music and looking happy, while people, at least in some of the photos, are still wearing face masks, maybe checking their phones around these mannequins. And of course there's bowls of plastic food, it looks like, on these tables. It doesn't look like it's real food. One of the few pictures they actually have of the restaurant, you can see inside that what looks like one of the workers is wearing full medical garb, and outside the restaurant are Chinese police looking like they're inspecting people. And you only see a few individuals standing in line who are keeping this whole social distancing thing. But regardless, according to China Daily, Wuhan residents are reviving their appetite for life and noodles. Now, with that said, it's Monday, so let's jump into some questions and comments from viewers. As I mentioned, every Monday we'll be going through some of the questions and comments you folks leave in the comment section on the videos. We'll be posting some here, answering some. So folks, again, if you have questions or comments, leave them in the comment section. I do read them, I will get to them. And every Monday we'll be going over some of these. First is from Hover Age. Said, could you post the sources in the description? Please, I would like I would need them to share the info within my area. I know I said I'd post the sources for the videos in the description. Unfortunately, the source documents are too long. Let me think of a solution to this. I might put them in a Google Doc, and we'll link the Google Doc in the description. That could be the temporary solution for that. Next is from bclon1. Why isn't there an Epoch Times journalist at the White House press conferences? We need you there. Thank you. Actually, we do have a couple White House reporters. The Epoch Times does have journalists at the White House. Unfortunately, though, because of the new social distancing rules and because of what's happening right now, we are not allowed in. They, of course, kicked a lot of journalists out to allow for, say, select media. And unfortunately, I'm sure not a lot of people are aware, but the journalist system around the White House is not controlled by the White House. It's controlled by the press pool, which is basically a circle of mainstream news outlets who decide who gets priority. The White House doesn't select them. And of course, we were not included in that selection. Next up is from Weekly Memes. Are these 5G conspiracies true? I've seen a lot of conspiracies around 5G, so it's hard to say which one you're talking about. I would say plausible or possibly. I wouldn't say absolutely, but possibly. A few of us, including myself, have been looking at, a few China watchers, have been looking at what's happening in Wuhan. And there is something very bizarre there, because it does seem that in China, the death rate among Chinese is higher in Wuhan than in other places, at least based on what we can confirm. It's unclear why that is. There are speculations that, well, maybe it's because of 5G, because Wuhan was, of course, the main area where the Chinese regime launched a lot of its 5G programs. Some people have pointed out that at about 60 gigahertz, which 5G does hit, the signals can break oxygen molecules, which could, when you're dealing with a virus that affects your oxygen intake, affects your lungs, could, of course, make symptoms worse. Whether that's the case, I don't know. I can't say for sure. What I can say is that the Chinese Communist Party's systems for 5G are not as advanced as other countries. The Chinese regime's 5G systems, you need a whole lot more infrastructure than the US ones. Basically, 5G is a fifth-generation technology for these telecommunication systems, and of course works on the electromagnetic spectrum. Of course, there's the sonic spectrum of sound, the electromagnetic spectrum of light. And when you're dealing with different frequencies within the electromagnetic spectrum, of course it's unclear which frequencies can affect physical human cells or oxygen molecules. The Chinese Communist Party does experiment on things like this. There have been some documents, for example, on its Assassin's Mace program that have talked about its experiments on electromagnetic weapons. And of course, we do know the Chinese Communist Party has weaponized things like the sonic spectrum. You may remember some articles about sonic weapons attacks on U.S. embassies, for example. Whether that's the case with this, who knows? I mean, it's we can't. I'd say it's possible, but I wouldn't say anything definite on it. Next up, we have Lisa Taylor. Question: Josh, could Taiwan appeal to the General Assembly of the UN or to the Secretary General of the UN? This is about Taiwan being, I assume, Taiwan being denied entry to the WHO. Unclear. The United Nations in general seems pretty close to the Chinese Communist Party and has for a very long time kept Taiwan out. Remember that Taiwan used to be recognized as the official government of China. The United Nations was the first to break from that and recognize the Chinese Communist Party in mainland China as the official government of China. And of course the United States followed on that. I personally don't think the United Nations would accept an appeal from Taiwan like that. Of course we'll have to see. Maybe if the US pulls out funding from the United Nations, maybe if international pressure increases on the United Nations, which it currently is, things will change, but really who knows. The fact that they just let the Chinese Communist Party into this Human Rights Council panel suggests the United Nations isn't backing off of its close relationships, we could call it, with the Chinese Communist Party. Next is from World Star News. Could you please address and check Lao Y86 video on the source of the CCP virus? He has investigated into finding patient 0 and has compelling proof. I feel like many media outlets haven't gone into depth on the subject of the virus lab in Wuhan, with all the distractions MSN, mainstream media, and Chinese propagandists have been pushing. Please don't let his findings be diminished. Stay safe and love, hearing the truth from you, brother. I appreciate it. I haven't watched this video yet. A few people did send it to me, and I will check it out. On the note of patient 0 and of the virus origin and the laboratory, the Epoch Times is going to be releasing an investigative documentary which I've been involved with. It should be out in about a week, and so I'll keep you updated here. We do go in depth into that laboratory, into the research they were doing, into some of the whistleblowers who did come out of that lab, and of course into rumors of a possible patient 0 starting with that laboratory. The documentary doesn't draw any hard conclusions, but I think we show some pretty interesting evidence that really needs more attention. Keep an eye out for it. I'll keep you all alerted. Next is from Zachary C. Hello, I've been enjoying your videos. A scientist working at the P4 bioweapon lab named Huang Yanglin, who is suspected to be patient 0, has gone missing. What is really going on in Hubei province, and how do we learn the truth if there is a cover-up? Yes, I'm aware of this individual being possibly patient 0. Yes, again, we'll be having a documentary coming out very soon, looking into this laboratory, looking into some of the leaks that have come out, and looking into some of the whistleblowers who have reported on things coming out of that lab. In terms of how do we learn the truth if there is a cover-up, it's very hard in China because the Chinese Communist Party censors all information. It's very difficult to get information. You know, it's hard to maintain a lie for a very long time. And it's also hard for them to censor everything. And so information does get out. Sometimes they need to change the narrative and then try to delete history. But when you have the internet, and a global internet at that, and you have web archives and foreign internets that don't necessarily fall under the control of the Chinese internet, of course it is not as difficult to confirm things and prove when they're lying. Next is from Chow Fur Now Meow. Do you come across on your channel that there are a lot of pro-CCP comments? Just wondering because I've seen many in other news channels on YouTube. They either call people to be racist against the Chinese or write something that read like a propaganda textbook. Some of them even threaten Taiwan. How does the West stop China's CCP from infiltrating real information to the rest of the world? I know I do click on their handles, and many of their accounts are only created 3 weeks ago. What's your opinion on this? And in parentheses, I love watching your videos, by the way. Hi. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. So the Chinese Communist Party does have very large-scale disinformation operations, and even government branches that work on operations like this. Of course, we all heard all this news about Russian disinformation and Russian propaganda and, Russian election interference. The Chinese Communist Party has an entire military branch dedicated to political warfare. That's the General Political Department. They run the Liaison Department. The Liaison Department works on these operations abroad. If you were to go on the, as I mentioned before, the Chinese consulate website in New York, they have the Liaison Department and the United Front Department listed on their website. The Chinese Communist Party is very open with these systems because nobody talks about them. When it comes to web comments, they have the 50-cent army. The 50-cent army is basically an army of internet trolls they pay to leave comments on YouTube, to leave comments on the Chinese internet, to insult people, to attack people, to push the Chinese Communist Party's narratives. The Chinese Communist Party is very open about this. They're very aggressive about it. And yes, they're not being called out nearly as much as they should be. Hopefully this will change. Hopefully things will change, but we'll have to see. Now that said, thank you all. I really appreciate your support. I've been reading your comments. You folks are great. I really enjoy reading what you have to say. And of course, you have questions for me. Every Monday I'll be going over some of the questions and comments from you. And of course, folks, please remember to like and subscribe. I really need your support. Really trying to help this channel grow. I really appreciate your support. It's meant a lot to us. That said, folks, see you next time.